The gun pressed against Elena Marsh's ribs the night before her wedding, and she did not even flinch. The man holding it smelled like cheap cologne and cigarette smoke, and his hand shook more than hers did. He had followed her out of the diner where she worked, into the alley behind the dumpsters, and told her in a low voice that she should call off the wedding to Dominic Rossetti unless she wanted her family to disappear one by one. Elena looked at him the way a teacher looks at a child who has said something foolish, and then she asked him, quite calmly, if he knew whose idea this really was. He did not answer. He could not answer, because he did not know, and that not knowing was the first sign that something in this town, in this marriage, in this entire arrangement, was far more dangerous than anyone imagined. 3 days earlier, nobody in Millhaven had believed the rumor when it started. Elena Marsh, 26 years old, a waitress at the Blue Kettle Diner on Main Street, engaged to Dominic Rossetti, the man whose family name made grown men lower their voices in restaurants. The town gossiped about it before Elena herself had even signed the marriage certificate. They said she must have tricked him somehow, that a plain girl from a 2-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane did not simply catch the eye of a man like that, unless she had done something clever, something desperate, something beneath her. Nobody asked Elena what she thought about any of it. Nobody ever did. She had grown up in Millhaven her whole life, in a house that smelled like old wood and coffee, raised by a father who worked long hours and rarely spoke about the years before Elena was born. People in town remembered her as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of girl who blended into a room the way old wallpaper does. She waited tables, she paid her bills, she kept to herself, and she let people believe whatever story was easiest for them to tell. It was safer that way. It had always been safer that way. The morning of the wedding, Elena stood in front of a mirror in a rented dress that did not quite fit right at the shoulders, and she practiced the expression she would need to wear for the rest of her life. Calm, grateful. A little bit dazed, like a woman who still could not believe her luck. It was not difficult to perform. She had been performing versions of herself for years. Dominic Rossetti did not smile at the altar. He stood in a dark suit with his jaw set, his eyes moving over the small crowd of guests as if he were counting exits rather than admiring flowers. And when Elena walked toward him, he studied her the way a man studies a contract he has not fully read. Their vows were short. Their kiss was brief and cold. The reception, held in a private hall on the edge of town, was full of men in expensive suits who did not smile, and women who watched Elena with narrowed eyes, whispering behind champagne glasses about how long this marriage would last, how quickly she would be replaced, how strange it was that a man like Dominic would choose someone so plain. Elena heard every word. She smiled through all of it. Later that night, in the car taking them to the Rossetti estate, Dominic finally spoke to her directly for the first time since the ceremony. He did not look at her when he said it. "You understand this is not a real marriage," he said. "My father wanted stability. A wife who is quiet, who does not ask questions, who does not embarrass the family name. You fit that requirement. Nothing more will be expected of you." Elena kept her eyes on the passing streetlights and said nothing. It was easier to let him believe he had chosen the terms. The Rossetti estate sat behind iron gates on a hill outside town, a stone house with more rooms than Elena had ever seen in one building, staffed by people who watched her with polite, careful faces that gave nothing away. Dominic's younger sister, Camille, met them at the door with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "So this is the diner girl," Camille said, looking Elena up and down like she was inspecting a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. "I suppose Father's plan was for someone forgettable. Congratulations, you certainly fit the description." Elena smiled politely and thanked her for the warm welcome. Camille's mouth twitched, unsure what to do with a woman who did not rise to the insult. That first night, alone in a guest bedroom far from Dominic's own quarters, Elena sat by the window and looked out over the grounds, at the guards stationed near the tree line, at the cameras mounted along the outer wall, at the pattern of lights that clicked on and off as the security rotation changed. She counted the guards. She noted the gaps in their coverage near the east garden, where the wall dipped low behind an old grove of trees. She noted which windows had working alarms and which did not. Nobody in Millhaven had ever asked Elena Marsh why she noticed things like that. Nobody had ever asked why a diner waitress could read a room the way a soldier reads a battlefield, why her hands stayed steady when a coffee pot shattered on the floor, why she had once calmly walked a choking customer through the exact motions to save his own life, while everyone else panicked. They had decided who she was the moment they saw her apron and her modest house, and Elena had let them, because being underestimated had kept her safe for a very long time. Her father had not been an accountant, as the town believed. He had spent 15 years in a unit that did not officially exist, doing work that was never written down, and when he finally came home to raise his daughter alone, he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had trained her, not for sport, not for hobby, but the way a man trains a child he is afraid he will not always be able to protect. Elena had grown up running drills in the woods behind their house before school, learning to read a person's intentions from the way they held their shoulders, learning that the most dangerous people in any room are rarely the ones who look dangerous. She had buried all of it the day her father died, 4 years ago, and became exactly the kind of woman nobody would ever suspect of anything: quiet, small, forgettable, until a man named Dominic Rossetti needed a wife nobody would question, and his father's advisors picked her file out of a stack because she looked harmless on paper. Nobody had done a deeper search. Nobody had thought they needed to. Elena remembered the exact morning her father had decided she was ready to learn more than most children ever needed to know. She had been 9 years old, standing in the kitchen with a bowl of cereal going soft in front of her, when her father sat across from her and asked if she wanted to learn a game. The game turned out to be reading faces, guessing what a stranger in a photograph was thinking, based on the set of their jaw or the tension in their hands. She had been good at it from the start, better than her father expected, and over the following years, the games became less like games and more like lessons: how to move without making noise, how to notice which door in a room led outside fastest, how to tell when someone was lying by the rhythm of their breathing rather than the words they chose. Her father never explained exactly what he had done during those 15 years away from home, only that the work had cost him more than it had given him, and that he wanted his daughter prepared for a world that did not always announce its dangers politely. When he died, quietly, in his sleep, 4 years before the wedding, Elena had grieved alone in the house they shared, and then she had packed away every part of herself that did not fit inside the life of a small-town waitress. She told herself it was safer. She told herself nobody needed to know, and for 4 years, that had been true. The people of Millhaven saw a woman who refilled coffee cups with a polite smile, who walked home alone at night without seeming to notice the dark, who never raised her voice even when a customer did. They decided she was simple, because simple was easy to understand, and Elena let them decide that, because being invisible had its own kind of safety. It was only now, inside a house built from stone and secrets, that the skills her father had given her were waking up again, stretching after a long sleep, ready to be used the way they were always meant to be used. The first week of the marriage passed in a strange, careful silence. Dominic left early each morning and returned late each night, speaking to Elena only when necessary, treating her more like a guest in his home than a wife. Elena used the quiet to learn the house. She memorized the schedules of the staff, the habits of the guards, the location of every door that led outside without passing a camera. She learned which of Dominic's men lingered too long near his office door, listening, and which ones avoided eye contact with her entirely, as if guilt sat heavy on their shoulders. Camille made a habit of visiting Elena's part of the house uninvited, always with a comment disguised as friendly advice. She told Elena which fork to use at dinner, as though Elena had never seen silverware before. She mentioned, almost too casually, that previous women who had come close to the Rossetti family had a way of losing their nerve and disappearing within a few months, as if daring Elena to ask what she meant by that. Elena never took the bait. She thanked Camille for her guidance, refilled her own tea, and let the silence stretch until Camille grew bored and left the room, visibly frustrated that her needling produced no reaction. The household staff proved more useful than Camille ever could. Elena learned their names quickly and treated them with the same quiet respect she had once given to customers at the diner, and in return, small pieces of information came her way without her ever needing to ask directly. A housekeeper mentioned that Walter Higgins often took calls late at night from a number the house line did not recognize. A young groundskeeper, grateful for a kind word after Camille had scolded him publicly, mentioned that 2 of the outdoor guards had been reassigned the week before the wedding, replaced by men nobody on staff had worked with previously. None of it was proof of anything. All of it was useful. At night, when the house finally settled into stillness, Elena walked the halls in soft shoes, learning which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent, memorizing the estate the way her father had once taught her to memorize an unfamiliar building before deciding it was safe to sleep in it. She was not yet sure who wanted her gone. She was becoming very sure that someone did. It was on the 7th night that the first threat arrived, slipped under the door of her bedroom while she slept, a single folded note with no signature. It told her, in short and ugly words, that she should leave the marriage before something happened to her that could not be undone. Elena read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer instead of reporting it to anyone. She wanted to know who had access to that hallway at night before she decided who to trust. The following morning at breakfast, Dominic's consigliere, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Walter Higgins, studied Elena over his coffee, with the kind of attention that made the hair on her arms rise. "You are settling in well," Walter said, though it did not sound like a compliment. "Some wives find the adjustment difficult, the isolation, the rules. I imagine a woman from your background finds all of this rather overwhelming." "I manage," Elena said simply, and returned to her toast. Walter's eyes lingered on her a moment too long before he excused himself from the table. Dominic, seated at the head of the table, had watched the exchange without comment, but later that day, as Elena walked the garden path alone, she noticed him watching her from an upstairs window, his expression unreadable. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply continued walking, aware now that someone in this house was already testing her, watching for the moment she would break, and she intended to give them nothing to work with. That evening, Dominic finally sought her out, finding her in the library, where she had been reading in silence. "My men tell me you ask very few questions," he said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Most people in your position would want to know more about what they have married into." "Would the answers change anything?" Elena asked, not looking up from her book. Dominic did not respond right away. Something in her calm unsettled him, though he could not name it yet. "There are people," he said finally, "who are not pleased about this marriage. Men who believe my father's choice makes the family look weak. It is possible some of them may try to send a message through you." "I understand," Elena said. "You do not seem frightened." Elena finally looked up at him. Would being frightened change anything? Dominic studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a lock he cannot quite pick, and then he left without another word. Elena returned to her book, though her mind was already elsewhere, running through the guest list from the wedding, the names of the men who had refused to shake Dominic's hand, the whispered conversations she had overheard near the bar. Somewhere in that crowd was the person who wanted her gone, and somewhere in this house was someone feeding them information. 2 nights later, the man in the alley pressed a gun to her ribs and told her to leave. Elena did not run. She did not scream. She memorized his voice, the scar above his left eyebrow, the tattoo peeking from beneath his sleeve, and she filed every detail away, the way her father had taught her, because information was the only weapon she needed in that moment. "Tell whoever sent you," she said quietly, "that I am not going anywhere." The man's hand trembled harder, and after a long, tense breath, he lowered the gun and disappeared into the dark, leaving Elena alone in the alley, with her heartbeat steady, and her mind already working through what came next. She walked back to the estate in silence, past the guards who did not know she had left, through a gap in the security she had already mapped out days before. She let herself into her room, locked the door, and sat by the window once more, watching the tree line where the lights failed to reach. Somewhere out there, a hit squad was waiting for its chance. Somewhere inside this house, someone was helping them. And somewhere beneath the quiet, forgettable woman everyone in Millhaven had mocked, a very different person was beginning to wake up. She thought of Dominic's face at the window that afternoon, watching her walk the garden path without knowing why he could not look away. He did not trust her yet, he barely knew her. But something in him had already sensed that his new wife was not what his father's advisors had promised, and that unease would either make him an ally or make him a danger of his own. Elena intended to find out which, before anyone else in this house decided the answer for her. She thought, too, of her father, of the quiet mornings in the kitchen, and the lessons disguised as games, and she wondered if he had known, somehow, that the life he prepared her for would eventually come looking for her again, no matter how far she buried it. Perhaps that was the nature of the skills he had given her. They did not disappear, they only waited. Elena closed the drawer where the folded note still sat, turned off the lamp beside her bed, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her, cataloging every distant sound, every footstep in the hallway, every creak of old wood shifting in the night breeze. Somewhere beyond these walls, the man from the alley was reporting back to whoever had sent him, explaining that the diner girl had not run, had not screamed, had not behaved like any of the wives who came before her. Elena Marsh had spent 4 years hiding what she was. That hiding was about to end. The trellis in the east garden collapsed the moment Elena's hand touched it, and only years of trained reflex kept her from breaking her neck on the stone path below. She twisted mid-fall, caught the edge of a low wall with her forearm, and rolled hard onto the grass instead of the stone, the wooden trellis crashing down beside her in a shower of splintered wood and torn vines. For a long moment, she lay still, breathing carefully, checking her body the way her father had taught her, joint by joint, before she allowed herself to move. Nothing broken. A deep bruise forming along her arm, a few scrapes that would sting later. She sat up slowly and looked at the trellis, at the base where the wood had supposedly rotted through, and she saw immediately that the cut was too clean, too deliberate, made by a saw rather than time and weather. Someone had wanted her standing beneath it when it fell. By the time a guard reached her, drawn by the noise, Elena had already composed her face into the expression of a startled, shaken woman, the kind of expression everyone in this house expected from her. She let the guard help her to her feet. She let him apologize for the state of the garden. She said nothing about the clean saw marks she had already memorized, because the person who had done this needed to believe their message had landed exactly as intended, unnoticed and unremarkable, just an accident that could have happened to anyone. It had been 2 weeks since the wedding, and in that time, Elena had learned to live inside 2 versions of herself at once. To the household staff, to Camille, to the men who guarded the estate, she was the same quiet, slightly overwhelmed small-town bride they had decided she would be from the very beginning. Polite. A little shy, grateful for a life she had supposedly stumbled into. Underneath that performance, she spent her days and nights building a map of the estate and its people that grew more detailed with every conversation, every overheard phone call, every unguarded glance she caught between men who thought nobody was paying attention. Camille found her in the kitchen that evening, nursing a cup of tea with her sleeve pulled down over the bruise on her arm. "I heard about the trellis," Camille said, settling into a chair across from her with the same too sweet smile she always wore. "Though I suppose old gardens can be dangerous if you don't know where to walk." "I suppose so," Elena said, not looking up from her tea. "You really should be more careful," Camille continued, studying her nails. "This family has enough to worry about, without a wife who cannot manage a simple walk through a garden." Elena set her cup down gently. "I'll be sure to watch my step." Camille's eyes flicked toward the bruise peeking out from under Elena's sleeve, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face that was not quite concern and not quite satisfaction, gone too quickly for Elena to be certain which it truly was. It was the kind of expression a person wore when they already knew the answer to a question they were pretending to ask. Elena filed that away too. Dominic found her later that night in the hallway outside her room, his expression unusually tense. "I heard you were hurt," he said. "It's nothing. An old trellis gave out." "Show me." Elena hesitated only a second before pulling back her sleeve, revealing the deep purple bruise along her forearm. Dominic's jaw tightened as he studied it, and for the first time since their wedding, something in his cold, careful expression cracked, just slightly, into what looked almost like concern. "That garden was inspected a month ago," he said quietly. "The wood should not have failed." Maybe the inspection was wrong. Maybe, Dominic said, though his tone made it clear he did not believe that any more than she did. He studied her a long moment, the silence between them heavier than it had been in the 2 weeks since their wedding. "You don't seem frightened," he said again, echoing the words he had spoken to her once before. "Most people, after something like this, would want to leave, would want protection, would want answers." "Would demanding those things bring me any of them faster?" Elena asked. Dominic did not have an answer for that. He left her at her door with a final glance that lingered a moment too long, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit the picture he had been given. Elena spent that night awake, replaying every detail of the day, the clean saw marks on the trellis, Camille's flicker of an expression that was not quite concern, the 2 new guards the groundskeeper had mentioned days earlier, the ones nobody on staff had worked with before. She thought about the folded note still hidden in her drawer, the man in the alley with the trembling gun, the pattern beginning to form from all of it. Someone wanted her gone badly enough to risk exposing themselves inside the estate itself, which meant this was no longer a distant threat delivered by strangers. It was close, it was patient, and it was willing to wait for the perfect accident. The next morning, Elena requested access to the household's maintenance records, framing it as simple curiosity about how the historic garden was cared for. The staff, charmed by her polite interest and grateful for any attention paid to their work, handed over the logs without hesitation. Elena found what she expected. The trellis had indeed been inspected a month prior and marked as structurally sound. Someone had altered it after that inspection, and whoever had done it knew Elena's habit of walking that path each evening after dinner, a habit she had only developed in the last week. That meant someone inside the house was watching her closely enough to learn her routines. That narrowed the list considerably. Elena began testing people the way her father had once tested strangers in crowded rooms, small deliberate changes in her own behavior designed to reveal who was paying attention. She changed her evening walk to a different path for 3 days and watched to see who commented on the change. She mentioned, quietly and only once, a fake detail about visiting her old diner that weekend, and waited to see if word of it reached anyone who should not have known. She watched Walter Higgins most closely of all, noting the late-night calls the housekeeper had mentioned, the way his eyes tracked Elena's movements around the house, with a little too much interest for a man who claimed to see her as unimportant. She also began paying closer attention to the 2 new guards the groundskeeper had mentioned, a pair of men named Frank Dorsey and Colin Bates, who had joined the estate's security detail only days before the wedding. Neither man spoke much, and both seemed more interested in the layout of the house than in the grounds they were supposedly hired to protect. Elena watched them from a distance, noting how Frank always positioned himself near the east wing during the evening shift change, how Colin lingered by the security office longer than his duties required, chatting with the young technician who monitored the camera feeds. One afternoon, Elena brought a tray of lemonade out to the guards stationed near the garden, playing the part of a thoughtful young wife checking on the men who worked long hours in the sun. Frank thanked her stiffly and returned to his post. Colin, more talkative, mentioned without thinking that he and Frank had both worked security for a shipping company before coming to the estate, a company Elena had never heard mentioned anywhere else in the household. She smiled, thanked him for the conversation, and walked back inside, already turning the detail over in her mind. Rossetti Family Security rarely hired outside their trusted circle. Someone had pushed these 2 men into the rotation, and someone with enough authority to do that without raising questions was either very high in the organization or very good at hiding their tracks. She raised the subject carefully with one of the older guards, a loyal man named Peter Doyle, who had worked for the family since Dominic was a boy, framing her question as simple curiosity about how new staff were chosen. Peter's brow furrowed as he admitted he did not remember approving Frank or Colin's hiring, and that such decisions usually crossed his desk before anyone new joined the rotation. He promised to look into it, and Elena thanked him, filing away the fact that whoever had placed those 2 men inside the estate had bypassed the family's normal security process entirely. On the 4th night, Elena's patience paid off. She overheard, through a partially open study door, Walter's voice low and urgent on a phone call, mentioning a name she did not recognize, and a date that was only 3 days away. She caught only fragments, Something about a shipment. Something about making sure the East Wing was clear that night. She could not be certain the call connected to the threats against her, but every instinct her father had trained into her said it did. She did not tell Dominic what she had heard. Not yet. She needed more than fragments before she brought her suspicions to a man who still did not fully trust her. A man whose loyalty to Walter ran deeper than his loyalty to a wife he had known for only a few weeks. Accusing his most trusted advisor on the strength of a few overheard words would only make her look paranoid, or worse, would give Walter time to cover whatever he was planning before she had proof strong enough to matter. Instead, she began quietly preparing. She spent an afternoon walking the East Wing under the excuse of admiring the old artwork hung along its corridors, memorizing which rooms had windows low enough to climb through, which closets held tools that could double as something more useful in an emergency, which door hinges squeaked, and which stayed silent. She noted that the East Wing's section of the security system ran on an older panel than the rest of the house, a detail she overheard the young technician complaining about one afternoon, while Colin lingered nearby pretending not to listen closely. An older panel meant a system easier to disable, or easier to convince someone to disable, if a person had the right access and the right reason to be trusted near it. She thought carefully about timing. Whatever Walter had planned for the date she overheard, it would need the East Wing empty and its security compromised at the same moment, which meant someone on staff would need to arrange both conditions without drawing attention. Elena began watching the shift schedules more closely, and on the afternoon before the date in question, she noticed that both Frank and Colin had been assigned to the East Wing's night rotation, a pairing that had not occurred once in the 2 weeks she had been tracking the guard schedule. That confirmed enough for her to act, even without full proof of who was behind it. She spent the following day preparing quietly, keeping her usual routine intact so nothing in her behavior would alert anyone watching her, all while running through the layout of the East Wing in her mind, again and again, until she could walk it blind. 3 nights later, on the exact date Walter had mentioned on the phone, Elena lay awake in her room long after the house had gone silent, listening to the familiar sounds of the estate settling for the night. Around midnight, she heard something that did not belong to the usual pattern, a soft scrape near the East Wing that most people would have mistaken for wind against old shutters. Elena knew better. She had spent 2 weeks learning every sound this house made, and this was not one of them. She rose from bed fully dressed, having stopped sleeping in night clothes 3 nights earlier for exactly this reason, and moved to her door without turning on a single light. The hallway was empty. The East Wing, where Walter had mentioned keeping things clear, sat 2 corridors away, dark and unusually quiet even for the hour. Elena did not go toward the noise. She went instead toward Dominic's quarters, moving through the house with the same silent, deliberate steps her father had drilled into her as a child, staying close to the walls where the floorboards held steadiest, avoiding the 2 spots in the main hallway she had already identified as loud enough to wake a light sleeper. She reached Dominic's door just as a second sound echoed faintly from the East Wing, a sound unmistakably like a window being forced open, despite the security system that supposedly covered every entrance to this house. Elena knocked once, sharply, and let herself in without waiting for an answer, finding Dominic already awake, sitting up in the dark with a gun in his hand, alert in a way that told her he had heard something too. "Someone is in the East Wing," Elena said quietly. "The window, not the door." Dominic's eyes narrowed at her, taking in the fact that she was fully dressed at midnight, that she had moved through his house without a single sound, that she stood in his doorway without a trace of the fear a normal woman would show in this moment. "How do you know that?" he said, and it was not really a question. "Because I've been listening to this house for 2 weeks, Elena said, "and that sound does not belong." Dominic rose from the bed, checked his weapon, and moved toward the door, pausing only a moment to look back at his wife standing calm and steady in the dark, a woman the entire town of Millhaven had dismissed as ordinary, watching him now with an expression that held no fear at all, only focus. "Stay here," he said. Elena did not answer him, because they both already knew she had no intention of staying anywhere near safe, while the house she had spent 2 weeks learning came under attack. She followed a few steps behind Dominic as he moved down the corridor, her bare feet silent against the old wood floor, her eyes already scanning for anything he might miss in the dark. They reached the entrance to the east wing together, and Dominic paused at the corner, listening. A third sound reached them then, softer than the first two, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard bearing weight where no one should have been standing. Dominic raised a hand, signaling her to stay back, and for a moment, Elena let him believe she would obey, staying pressed against the wall exactly where he had positioned her. The moment he moved around the corner, weapon raised, Elena moved too, but not behind him. She had already marked, days earlier, a second route into the east wing, through a narrow servants' passage that connected to the far end of the corridor, a route that would put her behind whoever had climbed through that window, rather than in front of them, where Dominic now stood exposed. She slipped through the passage in the dark, counting her steps the way her father had taught her, until she emerged in the shadow of a tall bookcase at the corridor's far end. There, in the dim light spilling from a half-open window, stood a man in dark clothing, crouched over a small case of tools, working at something near the base of the wall that Elena immediately recognized from her earlier exploration of the room, a junction box for the East Wing's older security panel. He was disabling it from the inside, confirming everything Elena had suspected about the timing, the guard rotation, and the older system Colin had been so curious about days before. Elena did not call out. She did not need to. Whatever waited in the East Wing, she intended to meet it eyes open, and whoever had ordered that trellis cut, whoever had whispered into a phone about a night when the halls would be clear, was about to discover that the woman they thought they could quietly remove had already been counting every door in this house since the night she arrived. She was 3 steps away, moving without a sound across the old floor, when the man finally sensed her presence and turned, too late, his hand reaching for something at his belt, as Elena closed the last of the distance between them. Elena's hand closed around the intruder's wrist before he could draw whatever waited at his belt, and she twisted it hard enough to hear him gasp, the small tool in his other hand clattering to the floor as she drove her knee into the back of his leg and forced him down against the old wood. He was strong, trained enough to try to reverse the hold, but Elena had spent years learning exactly how to counter that kind of struggle, and within seconds, she had him face down with his arm locked at an angle that made further resistance painful enough to discourage. Dominic rounded the corner at the sound of the scuffle, weapon raised, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of his wife kneeling on the back of an armed intruder, calm and steady, as though she had done this 100 times before. "Don't move," Elena said quietly to the man beneath her, and something in her voice made him go still immediately, more afraid of her in that moment than he had been of the gun in Dominic's hand. Dominic stared at her for a long, silent moment before finding his voice. "Who are you?" he said, and it was not a question about her name. Elena did not answer right away. She was focused on the man beneath her, patting down his jacket with one hand, while keeping his arm locked with the other, retrieving a folded photograph from his inner pocket. She held it up without releasing him. It was a picture of the estate's floor plan, with the east wing circled in red ink and a small note in the margin listing a time. Midnight, the exact hour the sound had woken her. "He's not here to steal anything," Elena said. "He's here to disable the security panel before someone else comes through this window." As if her words had summoned it, a second sound reached them from outside, footsteps moving quickly across the gravel path below the window, more than one set. Dominic's face hardened, and he moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside, while Elena kept the intruder pinned. "There are at least 2 more out there," Dominic said, moving toward the side entrance. The man beneath her shifted, testing the strength of her hold, and Elena adjusted her weight without effort, applying just enough pressure to remind him that struggling would cost him more than staying still. He was young, younger than she had first guessed in the dim light, with the kind of nervous energy that told her he had not done this sort of work for very long. That detail mattered. Experienced men rarely panicked when caught. This one's breathing had already gone shallow and quick, and his eyes kept darting toward the window, as though he was calculating whether he could still make it out before anyone stopped him. "Then we don't have long," Elena said. She looked up at her husband, and for the first time since their wedding, there was no performance in her expression at all, no trace of the quiet, overwhelmed bride the household had decided she was. "I need rope, or wire, anything to secure him. And I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes without asking why." Dominic hesitated only a moment before nodding, disappearing down the hallway toward a utility closet Elena had noted days earlier during her exploration of the house. He returned with a coil of electrical cord, and together, without speaking, they secured the intruder's hands and feet, Elena's movements quick and precise, in a way that told Dominic she had done this before, many times, in circumstances he could not begin to guess at. The side entrance alarm, faint and easily missed by anyone unfamiliar with the house, chimed softly from somewhere below, confirming that the second and third intruders had breached the ground floor. Dominic moved toward the stairs, and this time Elena did not wait to be told to follow. She moved with him, matching his pace step for step, her earlier caution about revealing herself entirely gone, now that the greater danger outweighed the risk of exposure. They found the two men in the kitchen, moving quickly and quietly toward the stairs that led to the family's private quarters, both dressed in the same dark clothing as the man Elena had subdued upstairs. Dominic raised his weapon, but before he could act, one of the intruders spotted them and lunged, not toward Dominic, but toward Elena, clearly having been briefed that she was the primary target of the night's operation. What happened next took less than a minute, though it would replay in Dominic's memory for far longer than that. Elena sidestepped the man's lunge with a movement so efficient it barely seemed like effort, redirecting his own momentum into the edge of the kitchen island hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, she brought her elbow down against the back of his neck, not with enough force to cause lasting harm, but more than enough to drop him to the floor, dazed and disoriented. The second intruder turned his attention toward Dominic, raising a weapon of his own, but Elena was already moving, sweeping a heavy cast-iron pan from the stove and driving it into his forearm with enough force to send the weapon skittering across the tile floor. Dominic closed the remaining distance and finished the job, pinning the man against the counter until he stopped struggling. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, and Elena felt her heartbeat only barely elevated, her breathing steady in a way that would have looked unnatural to anyone who did not understand what years of careful training could do to a person's response under pressure. She checked the man she had struck with the pan, confirming he was still conscious, but too disoriented to pose a further threat, and then turned her attention to securing both men with whatever she could find in the kitchen drawers, working quickly and efficiently, while Dominic stood watch over her shoulder, his weapon still raised toward the doorway, in case a fourth intruder appeared. None did. Whoever had planned tonight's attack had clearly not anticipated needing more than 3 men to remove a woman the household had spent weeks dismissing as harmless, and that miscalculation, Elena knew, would be the first crack in whatever careful plan had been built around her. The kitchen fell silent except for the ragged breathing of 2 subdued men and the low hum of the refrigerator, an oddly ordinary sound against the chaos of the last several minutes. Dominic looked at his wife across the room, at the calm, controlled way she stood over the man she had disarmed, not a single hair out of place despite everything that had just happened, and something in his understanding of who Elena Marsh really was shifted permanently. "You need to explain this to me," he said quietly. "All of it, now." Elena studied him for a long moment before nodding, aware that the careful wall she had built around herself for 4 years had finally, completely, come down. "My father spent 15 years doing work that never officially existed," she said. "When he came home, he trained me the way you train someone you're afraid won't always have someone else to protect them. I buried it after he died. I became exactly what this town expected me to be, because being underestimated kept me safe." She glanced down at the man groaning on the kitchen floor. "It's kept me safer than anyone in this house realizes." Dominic said nothing for a long moment, processing everything, his eyes moving between his wife and the 3 men now secured in different rooms of his own estate. "The wedding," he said slowly. "My father's advisors chose you because your file looked harmless." "It was supposed to look harmless," Elena said. "I made sure of that a long time ago." Guards finally arrived, alerted by the noise, and Dominic ordered the 3 intruders separated and held under guard until he decided what to do with them, giving instructions in a low, controlled voice that did not fully hide the shock still moving beneath his composure. Once the immediate danger had passed, he pulled Elena aside into the quiet of his study, closing the door behind them. 3 men breached this house tonight," he said. "Trained men, moving with a plan, targeting you specifically. That is not the work of some low-level rival trying to send a message. That takes resources, access, someone who knew our security schedule, our guard rotations, the layout of the East Wing well enough to plan around all of it. Someone inside, Elena said. Someone I trust, Dominic said, and the words seemed to cost him something. Which narrows the list to people who have earned that trust over years, not weeks. Elena hesitated only briefly, before telling him what she had overheard 4 nights earlier. Walter's voice low on the phone, the mention of a shipment, the instruction to keep the East Wing clear. She told him about Frank Dorsey and Colin Bates, the 2 guards placed into the rotation without going through the family's usual hiring process, both of them assigned to the exact wing and exact night the attack occurred. She told him about the older security panel, the one Colin had shown unusual interest in, the one that had been disabled from the inside by a man carrying a floor plan with the East Wing circled in red. Dominic listened without interrupting, his expression darkening further with every detail, until Elena finished and the study fell into heavy silence. Walter has been with this family since before I was born, Dominic said finally, his voice low. He served my father for 30 years. He was at my christening. He taught me how to negotiate before I was old enough to shave. If you're telling me he's the one behind this, you're asking me to throw away 30 years of loyalty on the word of a woman I've known for a matter of weeks. I know how that sounds, Elena said, her voice steady despite the challenge in his tone. I'm not asking you to believe it because I say so. I'm telling you what I heard, and what I found, and you can decide what to do with it. But ask yourself this. Who else in this house has access to the guard rotation? Who else could place 2 unfamiliar men into the security detail without the head of security noticing? Who else knew, days in advance, which wing of the house would be empty tonight? Dominic's jaw tightened, and he said nothing for a long moment, because every question she asked led back to the same uncomfortable answer, one he clearly did not want to accept. He raised concerns about this marriage from the beginning, Dominic admitted finally, almost reluctantly. He said a wife from outside the family's usual circles was a risk. I thought he meant the political embarrassment of it. I never considered he might have meant something else entirely. Maybe he did mean the embarrassment at first, Elena said. Men like that don't always start with the worst plan. Sometimes it grows slowly, the longer they watch something they think threatens their position. Dominic was quiet for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, the weight of everything Elena had just told him, settling over features that had gone carefully blank, the same way Elena's own face had gone blank 1,000 times over the years, whenever she needed to hide what she was truly thinking. If you're right, he said finally, then Walter has access to everything. My schedule, my communications, every decision this family makes. Then we don't confront him yet, Elena said. Not until we know exactly how deep this goes, and who else might be involved. If he suspects we know, he'll either run or accelerate whatever he's planning next, and we won't be ready for either. Dominic looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that was not quite trust yet, but was no longer the cold distance of the man who had married her as a formality only weeks earlier. You've been planning around all of this since the night you arrived, he said. It was not quite a question. Since before that, Elena admitted. I noticed things at the wedding, men who wouldn't meet your eyes, conversations that stopped when I walked near them. I didn't know yet what any of it meant, but I knew something was wrong long before that trellis fell. Dominic exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as he seemed to accept, finally and fully, that the woman his father's advisors had chosen for being forgettable was the single most capable person currently standing inside his house. Then we do this your way, he said, for now. Outside, in a separate room down the hall, the 3 subdued intruders sat under guard, silent and waiting for instructions that would not come from either Dominic or Elena that night, because both of them understood that the true danger had not been in the East Wing at all. It had been sitting at their own breakfast table for weeks, sipping coffee, offering false comfort, and watching Elena with careful, patient eyes that had already decided she needed to disappear before she became too dangerous to control. The trellis. The men in dark clothing. The phone call with instructions about a clear hallway. All of it had one source, and that source was still somewhere inside the walls of the Rossetti estate, believing his plan had simply failed rather than been anticipated from the very beginning. Before Elena left the study that night, Dominic stopped her at the door, his hand resting briefly against the frame, as though he wanted to say something, and had not yet found the right words for it. 3 weeks ago, he said, I told you this was not a real marriage. That nothing would be expected of you, beyond staying quiet and staying out of the way. I remember, Elena said. I was wrong, he said simply, and there was no charm in the words, no practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to saying what people wanted to hear. It sounded instead like a genuine admission, difficult and unfamiliar on his tongue. Whatever this marriage was supposed to be, it is not that anymore. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, aware that something between them had shifted permanently in the space of a single violent night, though neither of them yet had the language to describe exactly what that shift meant. She nodded once, a small, careful acknowledgement, and stepped out into the hallway, leaving Dominic alone with the weight of everything he now knew about the woman he had married, for reasons that no longer had anything to do with why she would stay. Elena intended to make sure Walter's next mistake would be his last, but she understood now that unmasking him would take more than instinct and overheard fragments. It would take patience, careful planning, and a partnership with a man who was only just beginning to understand what kind of ally he had gained, and what kind of enemy the household's most trusted advisor was about to become. The bullet meant for Elena's shoulder instead tore through the sleeve of her jacket, close enough that she felt the heat of it pass her skin, and she did not stop moving even for a second, driving forward into the shooter before he could correct his aim for a second shot. It was the 4th attempt in 10 days, and each one had grown bolder than the last, as though whoever was directing these strikes had realized their earlier, quieter methods had failed, and decided that subtlety no longer mattered. This attack had come in broad daylight, in the parking lot of the small pharmacy, where Elena had gone to collect a prescription for one of the household staff, a task so ordinary that even Dominic's increased security detail had not expected trouble in the middle of the afternoon. Elena disarmed the shooter within seconds, and by the time Dominic's men arrived, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, she already had the man restrained against the side of her car, calm and controlled, despite the torn sleeve and the thin line of blood where the bullet had grazed her arm. Dominic arrived moments later, having been called the instant his security detail heard the shot, and the look on his face when he saw the blood on her sleeve told Elena everything about how far his feelings toward her had shifted in the 2 weeks since the night in the East Wing. You said the parking lot rotation was secure, he said to the guard captain, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Elena had not heard from him before. It was, sir. According to the schedule, that lot should have had 2 men stationed at all times. Then where were they? The guard captain had no answer, and Elena, watching the exchange, filed away yet another piece of the growing pattern. Every failure in security seemed to trace back to schedules and rotations that Walter Higgins had access to, adjustments made quietly enough that nobody noticed the gaps until after they had already been exploited. Camille found them in the hallway as they returned to the estate, and for once, her usual composure slipped entirely at the sight of the torn, blood-stained sleeve on Elena's jacket. Whatever satisfaction she might once have taken in seeing Elena rattled seemed to falter in the face of an attack this serious, and for the first time since Elena had arrived at the estate, Camille's questions carried something that sounded almost like genuine concern rather than calculated cruelty. Someone shot at you, Camille said, staring at the sleeve. In broad daylight, in a pharmacy parking lot. I'm fine, Elena said simply. You don't seem fine. You don't seem anything, Camille said, and there was an edge of frustration in her voice now, as though Elena's calm unsettled her more than tears or panic would have. Most people would be frightened. Would being frightened help find whoever is doing this? Elena asked, and Camille had no answer, retreating instead into silence as Dominic guided Elena toward the study, leaving his sister standing in the hallway with an expression Elena could not quite read. Back at the estate that evening, with her arm cleaned and bandaged by a doctor sworn to the family's silence, Elena sat with Dominic in his study, the same room where they had first begun building whatever fragile alliance now existed between them. 4 attempts, Dominic said, pacing slowly in front of the window, each one closer than the last, He's getting desperate. Or he's running out of time, Elena said. Something is pushing him to move faster than he originally planned. That usually means someone above him is applying pressure, or he suspects we're getting closer to figuring out what he's doing. Dominic stopped pacing and looked at her. You still haven't told me how you plan to prove any of this. Suspicion isn't enough. If I move against Walter without proof, and I'm wrong, it destroys what's left of the family's stability. If I move against him, and I'm right, but can't prove it publicly, half the organization will assume I did it out of paranoia, and the other half will start asking who's really in control. Elena had already considered this problem for days. Then we don't move against him directly, she said. We let him make one more attempt, on our terms this time, in a place and time we choose, where we control every variable, instead of reacting to his. If we can catch him in the act, or catch someone connected directly to him, the proof exists on its own. Nobody has to take my word for anything. Dominic studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk of what she was suggesting. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to stop reacting to attacks I don't see coming, Elena said. I've survived 4 attempts because I was prepared, and because I got lucky more than once. Luck isn't a strategy. If we control the setting, we control the outcome. They spent the following morning going through every member of the household staff and security team, one name at a time, weighing who could be trusted completely, and who might, knowingly or not, pass information along to Walter, without realizing its importance. Dominic proved more clear-eyed about this process than Elena expected, setting aside personal loyalty in favor of cold, careful reasoning, crossing names off the list of people who would know about any planned operation, until only a handful remained, men who had served the family for decades without a single mark against them. If this goes wrong, Dominic said, studying the short list of names, we lose more than the element of surprise. We lose the last people in this house I know I can trust completely. Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong, Elena said. Every detail matters. The story we tell has to be believable enough that Walter risks acting on it, but controlled enough that we know exactly where and when he'll move. It took 2 more days of careful planning before they settled on the approach. Dominic would announce, quietly and only to a small circle of trusted staff, that Elena would be traveling alone to the family's smaller property outside the city limits to oversee renovations, a trip that would leave her without the estate's usual layers of security for several hours. The information was true enough to hold up under scrutiny, but the timing and route were entirely fabricated, designed to reach only the ears of people close enough to the family's inner circle to have access to real scheduling information. Elena spent those 2 days differently than she had spent any of the previous weeks. Rather than hiding her preparation, she allowed Dominic to see all of it, walking him through drills in the estate's private training room that few people knew existed, drills her father had taught her years earlier, refined now with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of quiet, careful practice. Dominic watched, initially with disbelief, and then with something closer to genuine admiration, as Elena moved through exercises that would have exhausted most trained men within minutes. Your father, Dominic said one evening, watching her work through a final set of drills, sweat clinging to her temples, her breathing controlled and even. What was his name? Daniel, Elena said, not slowing her movements. Daniel Marsh. He never told me exactly what unit he served in, only that the work didn't officially exist, and that most of the men he served with are dead now, one way or another. He would be proud of what you've become, Dominic said quietly. Elena stopped mid-motion, something in the simple statement landing harder than she expected. He'd be furious that I needed any of it again, she said finally. He wanted me to have a normal life, a quiet one. Would you have wanted that, before all of this? Elena considered the question honestly, perhaps for the first time. I told myself I did, she said. For 4 years, I told myself the diner, the small house, the quiet town, all of it was enough. I'm not sure I believed it as much as I thought I did. Dominic did not respond immediately, and something in the silence between them felt different than the careful, guarded silences of their first weeks together. It felt, for the first time, like 2 people beginning to actually know each other, rather than 2 strangers performing the roles a marriage of convenience demanded of them. The night of the planned trip arrived, and Elena drove the route alone, exactly as the fabricated schedule described, while Dominic and a small, carefully chosen team of loyal guards followed at a distance, staying far enough back to remain unseen by anyone watching for a tail. Elena's car moved through the quiet back roads outside the city, past dark fields and empty stretches of highway, and for the first 30 minutes, nothing happened at all. Then, near a narrow bridge crossing a shallow river, headlights appeared behind her, closing the distance too quickly for an ordinary driver on an empty road. Elena kept her speed steady, her hands calm on the wheel, watching the mirror as the vehicle behind her pulled alongside, a second car appearing from a side road ahead, to block her path entirely. She was ready for exactly this. Elena braked hard, spinning the wheel in a controlled maneuver her father had drilled into her on empty roads years earlier, sending her car into a sideways stop that put her in position rather than trapped between the two vehicles closing in. She was out of the car before the men in either vehicle had fully processed what had happened, moving toward the nearest threat, with the same calm precision she had shown in the kitchen weeks earlier. The first man barely had time to raise his weapon before Elena closed the distance, driving his arm upward and using his own balance against him, sending him hard into the side of his own car. The second man, more prepared, managed to get a shot off that went wide, and Elena felt the familiar cold clarity that came in moments like this, her mind stripping away everything except the immediate problem in front of her. She circled the front of her car, using it as cover from the second shooter's line of sight, her mind cataloging distances and angles the way her father had trained her to do, until it required no conscious thought at all. The river below the bridge ran loud in the darkness, masking the sound of her footsteps as she moved, and for a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but the rhythm of her own breathing and the positions of the two threats in front of her. The second shooter adjusted his aim, tracking her movement along the car, and Elena timed her next move precisely, waiting until he committed to the shot before dropping low and closing the distance in the same motion. His second shot went high, shattering the rear window of her car instead of finding her, and by the time he realized his mistake, Elena was already inside his guard, driving the heel of her palm into his jaw hard enough to send him staggering back against the guardrail of the bridge. That was when Dominic's team arrived, headlights flooding the narrow bridge, and the remaining attackers, outnumbered and exposed, made the choice to surrender rather than continue a fight they could no longer win. Dominic himself pulled one man from his car, pressing him against the hood with controlled fury, demanding to know who had sent him, while Elena secured the second man with the same efficient calm she had shown throughout the entire encounter. It was in the second man's jacket that they found what they needed. A phone, still active, with a single number labeled only as a set of initials, WH. Elena held it up for Dominic to see, and something in his expression finally settled into a hard, resolved certainty that had been building for weeks. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's enough to move." They returned to the estate before dawn, the captured men secured separately and questioned by people Dominic trusted completely, men with no connection to Walter's circle of influence. The interrogation itself was handled quietly, in a room far from the main house, by men who understood the value of patience over pressure. By morning, one of the men had confirmed what the phone already suggested, describing a series of instructions delivered over the past month, payments made through an account that traced back, through several careful layers, to funds Walter Higgins controlled directly. He described meetings in a small office above a shuttered bookstore 2 towns over, where Walter had laid out the plan in careful stages, framing it not as a betrayal of the family, but as a necessary correction to a mistake his father's advisors had made in choosing Elena at all. The man also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Walter had grown increasingly anxious in recent days, convinced that Dominic's new wife was somehow anticipating each attempt before it happened, and that this anxiety was what had pushed him to escalate from quiet accidents to open violence in broad daylight. Elena listened to this detail with quiet satisfaction. Walter had not been chasing her out of confidence. He had been chasing her out of fear, and fear made even patient men reckless. Dominic sat in his study as the sun rose, the proof laid out before him, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, staring at evidence that confirmed 30 years of trusted loyalty had been a careful, patient lie. He's going to know something is wrong, Elena said gently, watching her husband process the weight of the betrayal. Men don't disappear from a job without questions being asked, especially not tonight. We need to move before he realizes his last attempt failed. Dominic looked up at her, and the man she saw in that moment bore little resemblance to the cold, distant figure who had married her weeks earlier, as a political formality. This man looked tired and angry, and something else beneath both of those things, something that looked almost like gratitude. "Then we move today," he said. "Together." Elena nodded, already turning her mind toward what came next, aware that Walter Higgins, cornered and desperate, would not go quietly once he realized the woman he had spent weeks trying to eliminate had instead dismantled every advantage he once held. Before they left the study, Dominic paused at the door, watching her check the small weapon she had taken to carrying since the pharmacy attack, her movements practiced and unhurried, despite everything the coming day would demand of her. "I spent our wedding day thinking I had married the least dangerous woman in this town," he said quietly. "I understand now that I married the only person capable of surviving what my own family's carelessness nearly cost us both." Elena looked up at him, something steady and unspoken passing between them, an understanding built not from the vows they had exchanged weeks earlier, but from 4 attacks survived, a truth finally uncovered, and a trust earned the hard way, through fire rather than promises. "We're not finished yet," she said. "No," Dominic agreed. "But for the first time since this began, I like our odds." They walked out into the early morning light together, toward whatever confrontation with Walter Higgins still waited ahead, no longer a reluctant crime boss and the small-town wife the family had chosen for him, but 2 people who had finally, fully, become allies in every sense that mattered. Walter Higgins was already gone by the time Dominic and Elena reached his office, the desk drawers pulled open and emptied, a faint smell of burned paper still hanging in the air from documents destroyed in the fireplace only minutes before their arrival. "He knew," Dominic said, standing in the doorway, his jaw tight with fury. "Someone warned him." Elena crouched beside the fireplace, studying the curled remains of paper too damaged to read, her mind already racing through the implications. Walter had not simply fled in a panic. He had taken time to destroy evidence, which meant he still believed he had hours rather than minutes before anyone came looking for him. That meant he did not yet know his men from the bridge had talked, only that something had gone wrong the night before. "He thinks he still has room to maneuver," Elena said, standing. "That means he isn't running yet. He's regrouping." "Regrouping for what?" "For the only move that still makes sense to him," Elena said. "If he believes his plan against me has failed, and he suspects we're closing in, a man like that doesn't disappear quietly. He finishes what he started, or he takes down as much of the family as he can on his way out." Dominic's phone rang before he could respond, and the color drained slightly from his face as he listened to the voice on the other end. He ended the call and looked at Elena with an expression that confirmed her worst suspicion. "Camille," he said, "she's not at the estate. Nobody has seen her since early this morning." The pieces fell into place with a cold, sickening clarity. Walter had spent 30 years inside this family's inner circle. He knew every relationship that mattered to Dominic, every weakness that could be turned into leverage, and Camille, for all her sharp words and careful distance from Elena, was still Dominic's sister, still someone whose safety would force his hand in ways that threats against Elena alone had not. "He's using her to draw us out," Elena said. "He needs somewhere he still has control, somewhere isolated." Dominic's expression hardened as understanding dawned. "The old warehouse on the river. It belonged to my grandfather. Walter managed the property for years before it was decommissioned. If he wanted somewhere private, somewhere with exits only he knows well, that's where he'd go." They assembled a small team within the hour, moving with the same careful precision Elena had used throughout every encounter of the past weeks. No wasted motion, no unnecessary risk. Dominic wanted to bring a larger force, but Elena argued against it, knowing that a man as desperate as Walter had become would not hesitate to hurt Camille the moment he sensed an overwhelming show of force closing in around him. "We go in small," Elena said. "Quiet. I take the lead on entry. You and 2 men cover the exits. If he sees an army coming, he panics, and panic gets people killed. Dominic did not like it. But after everything he had witnessed over the past month, he no longer questioned Elena's read on situations like this one. They arrived at the warehouse as the sun began to set, the building's broken windows and rusted metal siding giving no outward sign of the danger contained inside, though the single vehicle parked near the loading dock confirmed they had guessed correctly. Elena moved through a side entrance she had identified from old property records Dominic kept in his study, a door long forgotten by anyone except the man who had once managed the building. Inside, the warehouse stretched out in shadow, stacks of old crates and rusted machinery, creating a maze of blind corners and narrow paths, exactly the kind of environment her father had trained her to navigate without hesitation. She heard Camille's voice before she saw her, low and defiant, despite an obvious edge of fear, arguing with someone Elena recognized immediately as Walter Higgins. "My brother will never let you walk away from this," Camille was saying. "You know that. Whatever happens to me, you're already finished." "Your brother," Walter said, his voice carrying the particular bitterness of a man who had spent decades believing his loyalty entitled him to more than he had ever received, "spent 30 years listening to my advice and taking credit for every good decision that came from it. I built half of what this family controls today, and when your father died, I expected some measure of that work to be recognized. Instead, I watched a boy who barely understood the weight of what he inherited make careless decision after careless decision, and the final one, the one I could not simply advise my way around, was marrying a diner waitress against my counsel. Within a month, she had undone more of my planning than any rival family managed in a decade. I am not finished. I am simply changing my approach."
"You could have simply left," Camille said, her voice sharp despite her bound hands. "Walked away with whatever pride you had left, instead of doing this."
"I gave this family 30 years, Walter said, and for the first time something raw and wounded showed beneath his careful bitterness. Men like me do not simply walk away. We finish what we started, one way or another." Elena moved closer, staying low behind a row of stacked crates, assessing the scene before committing to any action. Walter stood near a metal support beam, with Camille bound to a chair beside him, a weapon in his hand, his eyes darting frequently toward the warehouse's main entrance, as though he expected Dominic to come charging through it at any moment. He had clearly planned for that reaction. He had not planned for Elena to already be inside. She passed close enough to a stack of rusted machine parts to see her own reflection, faint and distorted, in a sheet of old metal leaning against the wall, and for a brief moment she thought of the woman she had been only weeks earlier, refilling coffee cups at the Blue Kettle diner, letting the world believe she was exactly as unremarkable as she appeared. That woman would not have known how to navigate a warehouse full of blind corners in near total darkness, would not have known how to read the tension in Walter's shoulders from 30 feet away, would not have understood that his darting glances toward the entrance meant he was more afraid than he was letting Camille see. That woman had served her well for 4 years, but she was gone now, and Elena did not mourn her. She continued circling, using the maze of crates to close the distance without revealing her position, until she stood no more than 20 feet from Walter, with a clear line to close the remaining gap before he could react. She waited, patient despite the tension coiling through her body, watching for the moment his attention shifted fully away from the entrance and toward Camille, who had continued speaking, whether from genuine defiance or an instinctive understanding that keeping him talking bought time. The moment came when Camille asked him, her voice cracking slightly despite her effort to hide it, whether he had planned to kill her from the very beginning, or if this was simply what happened when his careful plans fell apart. Walter turned toward her fully to answer, and in that instant, Elena moved. She crossed the remaining distance in seconds, driving into Walter before he registered the sound of her footsteps, knocking the weapon from his hand as they both went down hard against the concrete floor. Walter fought back with more strength than his age suggested, driven by desperation rather than skill, but desperation was no match for the years of controlled, deliberate training Elena had spent her entire life absorbing. She pinned him within moments, his struggles growing weaker as she applied enough pressure to hold him still without causing lasting harm, the same careful restraint she had shown every intruder who had come for her over the past month. Dominic and his men burst through the main entrance seconds later, drawn by the sound of the struggle, weapons raised, only to find Walter already subdued beneath Elena's controlled hold, and Camille, shaken but unharmed, still bound to the chair beside them. Dominic rushed to free his sister first, checking her over with an urgency that stripped away every trace of the cold, controlled man Elena had married weeks earlier, revealing instead someone capable of genuine fear and genuine relief. "I'm fine," Camille said, her voice unsteady despite the words. "I'm fine, Dominic." She got here before he could do anything. Dominic looked over at Elena, still kneeling on the concrete floor with Walter secured beneath her, and something passed across his face that Elena recognized immediately, because she had felt something similar herself in the weeks since her father's training had woken back up inside her. It was the specific relief of watching someone you had come to care for walk away from danger unharmed, a feeling that had nothing to do with duty or arrangement, and everything to do with something neither of them had expected to find in a marriage built entirely on convenience. Walter was taken into custody by men Dominic trusted completely, his 30 years of service ending not with the respect he had spent decades believing he deserved, but with the quiet, humiliating reality of being escorted out in restraints by the very organization he had tried to reshape through betrayal. He said nothing as they led him away, his earlier bitterness replaced now by a hollow, defeated silence, the silence of a man who had underestimated exactly the wrong person and paid the full price for that mistake. Walter's departure left the warehouse quieter than it had been in years, the last of his bitterness swallowed by the same shadows he had once used to plan Elena's downfall. Dominic lingered near the loading dock for a long moment after the vehicle carrying Walter disappeared down the gravel road, staring at nothing in particular, and Elena recognized the specific weight of grief that came with losing someone you had trusted, for reasons that no longer applied, even when that person had tried to have you killed. 30 years, Dominic said quietly, almost to himself. I keep thinking there must have been a moment I could have seen this coming, some warning I missed. Maybe there was, Elena said, or maybe some people simply reach a breaking point nobody else can predict, not even the people closest to them. Either way, it isn't your fault that a man you trusted decided loyalty owed him something the family never intended to give. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him even in their most difficult moments over the past month. "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Saying exactly the thing I need to hear without making it sound like comfort," he said. "Most people would try to make me feel better. You just tell me the truth." "Comfort doesn't fix anything," Elena said simply. "The truth at least gives you something to work with." Camille approached Elena as the warehouse slowly emptied, still shaken, but steadier than she had been minutes earlier, studying her former target of ridicule with an expression that held none of its earlier condescension. "I spent weeks telling everyone you didn't belong in this family," Camille said quietly, "that you were some plain, forgettable girl my brother's advisors had chosen, because she wouldn't cause trouble. I was wrong about all of it, wasn't I?" "You believed what everyone in Millhaven believed," Elena said, without bitterness. "I made sure of that a long time ago." "Why?" Elena considered the question honestly. "Because being underestimated kept me alive," she said. "It still does." Camille nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into her expression for the first time since Elena had arrived at the estate weeks earlier. "Well," she said, managing a faint, tired smile, "consider me thoroughly corrected." The drive back to the estate passed in a quiet that felt different from every silence that had come before it. Not the guarded, careful distance of two strangers, bound together by obligation, but the comfortable stillness of two people who had survived something together and come out the other side changed by it. Dominic reached across the space between them at one point and took Elena's hand, a small gesture that would have seemed insignificant weeks earlier, and now felt like the culmination of everything they had built since the night the trellis collapsed beneath her. "The town still thinks you're the diner girl who got lucky," Dominic said, as the estate's gates came into view ahead of them. "They have no idea what you actually are." "Let them keep thinking that," Elena said. "It's served me well so far." "And me," Dominic said quietly. "Whatever this marriage started as, I don't think either of us is walking away from what it's become." Elena looked over at him, at the man who had once told her, with cold formality, that nothing would be expected of her beyond staying quiet and out of the way, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to return to the life Millhaven had once mapped out for her. The quiet apron, and the modest house, and the careful, deliberate smallness she had built around herself for 4 long years. "No," she agreed. "I don't think I am either." The estate's gates closed behind them as the car pulled through, and for the first time since her father had died and left her alone with a set of skills she never expected to need again, Elena Marsh felt something close to peace. Not because the danger was entirely behind her, but because she had finally stopped hiding from exactly who she was, and the man beside her, rather than being frightened by that truth, had chosen to stand beside her because of it. Millhaven would go on believing whatever story was easiest to tell about the small-town girl who married a crime boss and somehow survived it. Elena no longer cared what they believed. She knew the truth now, fully and without apology, and so did the one person whose opinion had come, against every expectation she carried into that cold, formal wedding, to matter most of all.